So we're starting our new learning today, talking about we're going to start moving towards something called fiscal policy and something called monetary policy. And those will all be things we'll get to a little bit later. But the basis of fiscal policy and monetary policy is looking at the macroeconomy um, and looking at unemployment and GDP and inflation and being able to graph it. Okay. And like in microeconomics, we had a demand curve we learned about, and then we had a supply curve we learned about. In macro, it's called an aggregate demand curve. And an aggregate demand curve, you can see, we instead of labeling it D, like for demand, we label it AD for aggregate demand, and it's the demand for all goods and services in America. So it's the demand for all of our stuff, not just one item, not just one good, not just one market, but all the goods and services. So that means essentially what it makes up is our GDP. Okay, it makes up our GDP. So what goes into aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X. Okay, and like in demand, we can shift the demand curve when we had different like changes in income and stuff. Well, just like in that, we would change the AD curve, the aggregate demand curve, when one of these four things change, C, I, G, or X. So, and I'll graph it here in a second, but anytime one of these portions increases or decreases, it will increase or decrease the AD curve. So, for example, if we start spending a lot more money on goods and services, then the AD curve will shift to the right. If we start spending less money on goods and services, then it'll shift to the left, right? If we change taxes, for example, if taxes are lowered, that gives Americans more money to spend, and so consumer spending goes up and aggregate demand goes up. If taxes are increased, then that gives America less money and our aggregate demand shifts to the left. Same thing if the government spends more on goods and services, right? If the government spends more on goods and services and builds buildings and stuff, then that would increase the G portion of AD, which would shift AD to the right. Or if they spent less, it would shift to the left. Same thing with, for example, exports. If we exported more, that pushes the X portion of GDP up. So we export more, AD goes up. If we import more, AD goes down. So it looks kind of like this. Daisy, sorry, my dog is driving me crazy. Um, it looks kind of like this. If we wanted to graph it, we would, if we wanted to graph it, we would, instead of using, I'll have to do this left handed now, we would just graph it. Oh, let me get it with this. We would draw a curve. Okay, all right, my dog's going now. So we would draw the curve like this, right? And instead of having quantity at the bottom, and you'll see this, we're going to do so many videos of real GDP, sorry, so many videos of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, that you'll get used to this. But on the x-axis is real, that's supposed to be an R, real GDP, all right? And then on the y-axis is price level. So essentially on the y-axis is our rate of inflation, okay? And what this means also is the further we move to the right, okay, the more stuff we make, the more GDP we make, the less unemployment we're going to have, right? So the more crap we make, we're going to need more people to make it, so unemployment goes down. The less we make, the less our GDP, the further shit to the left, then we're going to be making, we're going to be having to make less stuff, which means our GDP goes down, which means our unemployment goes up. So on this graph, you can see we're going to be talking about price level, GDP, and unemployment. But aggregate demand just is like a demand curve, just downward sloping, right? So here's our aggregate demand, okay? If for some reason, and we know this is C plus I plus G plus X, if for some reason, there's an increase in consumer spending, like we lower taxes, or we just start spending more, or Americans started feeling good about themselves, it's like confidence wise, or if our wealth went up, well, then aggregate demand would move to the right, right? It would increase aggregate demand. So that'd be great. And that would mean price level would go up, unemployment would go down, and GDP would go up. Okay. So an increase in aggregate demand pushes um, prices up, it pushes GDP up, and it pushes price level down, our unemployment down. However, if there is a decrease in demand, if we have a higher taxes, or if we um, having less confidence, or like right now, making this during the pandemic, Americans just stop buying stuff, then aggregate demand shifts to the left, in some cases, very far to the left. And what that does is it gives us less GDP, it makes unemployment go up, and it brings prices down. So these shifts in aggregate demand change price level or inflation, unemployment, and GDP. Okay, so aggregate demand is a really important part of the macroeconomy. And you're going to be watching a lot of videos about how aggregate demand works, about how it shifts, all of that. And it's a really important part of it. So, and then you'll have some practice on just moving it. All right.